So the next speaker of this morning session is Luis Guerrero, coming from Spain, and he will speak about feeding habits and feeding behavior and the relationship between feeding habits and health. So thank you very much, Luis, for coming.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to be here today with all of you. Well, does health really matter? Well, probably most of you would say, yes, health is an important driver of consumer behavior. And I have to say that I agree with you, but, how can we explain behaviors such as smoking, unhealthy eating, or risk activities such as climbing, diving, and so on? So, well, I think that there is something else than health, and this is what I'm going to try to explain to you today. Well, what do we know about diet and health? Well, we have a huge amount of information and scientific evidences about the relationship between diet and health. We know that some diets seem to be healthier than others. This is the case of the Mediterranean diet. We also know that some products could improve our health and prevent us from suffering some diseases. This is the case, for instance, of fruit and vegetables, dietary fiber, fish, olive oil, and so on. Well, we not only have the scientific information, but we also have our culture that is full of messages about diet and health. Here you can see some examples, such as an apple a day, keep the doctor away, let food to be your medicine, or in Spanish, el aceite de oliva todo mal quita, that means olive oil is the cure for all diseases. We also have some of them in French. Dis-moi ce que tu manges, je te dirai ce que tu es. Tell me what do you eat, and I will tell you what you are. And, well, also even cultural acceptance or rejection of some food seems to be based on health-related issues, such as pork consumption and even our traditional cuisine. I think it's important to remark that most traditional foods survive because proved to be healthy, even though nowadays it's supposed healthiness can be excused as a result of our actual way of living. What I mean is that now we have higher food availability, higher energy intake, and lower physical activity than our parents had. So traditional foods, maybe they are not so healthy as we could expect. Well, we also have the effect of the recommendations from experts and friends, relatives, and so on. As you probably know, medical doctors are the most reliable source of information for consumers. In fact, some food products in Europe have their own network of medical advisors, medical visitors, similar to the pharmaceutical industry. So it's curious, but it's real. Well, mass media also have a relevant impact on consumers' education and belief formation. Nowadays, we are surrounded by low salt, low fat, low cholesterol, high fiber, proteins, vitamins, minerals, etc. Well, last week I heard my mother talking to a friend of hers about saturated fats. And well, my mother is 84 years old and has no idea about what saturated fat is. But she dared to talk about saturated fats. Well, theoretically, all these external inputs should increase consumer concern about diet and the importance of the right food selection and food consumption. So from a consumer point of view, and if we put all together these ingredients in the cocktail shaker, I mean the scientific evidence, advices, mass media, social pressure, personal experiences, culture, traditions, and so on, we will get a strong association between diet and health. So therefore, from a rational perspective, we should expect consumers to behave according to their beliefs. So this means in a healthy way. But we know that based on the scientific papers, and we have a large number of studies, that show important discrepancies between what consumers think they do, what consumers say they do, and what consumers actually do. So let me show you some examples of these inconsistencies. So in general, we tend to underestimate our supposed healthy habits, such as alcohol, salt, fat consumption, fast food consumption, etc. And however, we tend to overestimate healthy habits, such as physical activity, fruits and vegetables, olive oil consumption, etc. Quite frequently, we also tend to be contradictory. For instance, some consumers have negative attitudes and beliefs about meat and meat products, but their consumption remains constant. Well, other explanation for these discrepancies is the difficulty to remember past behaviors, mainly because we are only able to recall those irrelevant behaviors that took place in the last 3 or 4 days. Well, we have to bear in mind that food consumption is normally an irrelevant behavior, at least from the consumer point of view. Well, finally, we all, as human beings, are affected by social and moral norms, and we tend to believe that we normally follow them. Well, here you can see some examples of over- and underestimation of the actual behavior. In the first study was about fruit consumption in Spain in 2008, and we had a sample of 494 consumers. And in both fruits, apples and peaches, we observed an overestimation of the self-reported consumption that was higher for the most recently consumed fruit, in this case, peaches. And the explanation was because the study was done in summer. So in this case, we detected a seasonal effect on self-reported behavior. Well, in the second case, we had an important overestimation of fish consumption that obviously was lower for frozen fish. And in this case, the study was carried out in 2009 and with a sample of 919 consumers. And finally, in the last example taken from a scientific paper, authors observed a significant underestimation of fat intake among 1,057 consumers, Dutch consumers. So, how can we explain these discrepancies between what consumers say they do and what they actually do? Well, we have 2 possible explanations. The first one is that consumers lie, misunderstand the questions, or make an incorrect interpretation of these scales. And the second one is that consumers believe that they behave that way. Well, in my opinion, and based on my own experience with consumers, I don't think they lie. Normally, they are very interested and motivated and show a high involvement in the activities they do. So in my opinion, the most likely option is the second one, that consumers believe that they behave that way. In fact, there are different theories that may explain these discrepancies, and I would like to focus on some of them, such as optimistic bias, mental disengagement, direct or intentional forgetting, and unconscious or emotional behavior. Okay, look at this picture. Here you have another one. Okay, why do you think that people take these risks? Well, in my opinion, the answer is quite simple, because they think that nothing bad is going to happen to them. And this thinking or feeling is called optimistic bias. So optimistic bias is defined as an overestimation of the probability of having positive events or an underestimation of the probability of suffering negative events. In fact, optimistic bias is a protective mechanism in order to make our life easier. So we cannot have a normal life if we have to think continuously about the bad things that can happen to us. So it's quite normal in human beings. The intensity of optimistic bias depends on the individual, so not everybody has the same confidence in their own skills and luck. It also depends on the impact of the negative effect, so the level of worry and anxiety is different when taking a plane than when taking a bus. So an accident in the first case, although less unlikely, implies almost certainly death. And other curious effect is the immediateness of the consequences. So if the negative outcome of the behavior occurs very rapid, the optimistic bias will be lower. Well, a friend of mine that is a psychologist always say that if young girls and boys first had the baby and 9 months later had the orgasm, the incidence of unwilling pregnancy would go down in an important way. And I think it's totally true. Well, consciousness is also very important. Normally, people who had previous experiences with the outcome of a specific risk, I mean accidents or diseases, are more sensitive to the behavior and used to show lower optimistic bias. Probably this is one of the reasons why older people tend to be more realistic about actions and cost. Well, and finally, we have the perceived propensity. That is a subjective perception that depends on the individual and on a large number of factors. In this table, you can see how optimistic bias can influence consumer intention. So you can see that those consumers having higher optimistic bias are also those with higher intention to reject functional cheese. Well, I think the explanation is easy. Obviously, they don't need it because they are sure that nothing bad is going to happen to them. So why should I consume a functional cheese? Well, as you can see in this figure, an important percentage of consumers show some level of optimistic bias. As I told you before, it's a normal protective mechanism in human beings. So this result is not surprising. This is for Spain, but I'm sure that all around the world is quite similar. Well, in this case, you have another example that shows different level of optimistic bias depending on some diseases or actions. Please look at the items in yellow and blue, and it's curious to observe how the risk perception change depending on whether the respondent has the control or not. I mean, I perceive less risk if I'm the driver, I mean, if I drive the car myself, than if someone else is driving. So this is also a human belief and a human behavior. Well, mental disengagement or direct or intentional forgetting are also psychological protective mechanisms. As you probably know, happiness seems to be related to personal well-being and satisfaction. All of us have positive and negative experiences in our life. Normally, positive experiences tend to increase our happiness, while negative experiences tend to decrease our happiness. Well, in some cases, and when we have negative experience, we can develop different psychological protective mechanisms, such as mental disengagement or direct forgetting, that makes people to forget these negative experiences and avoid their negative effect on happiness. So these two mechanisms may also explain the already mentioned discrepancies between self-reported and actual behavior. Obviously, there are some other factors that can explain the gap between what consumers should do from a rational perspective and what they actually do. One of these factors is habit. Habit implies automatic responses, low consciousness, low control, and a high mental efficiency. And as a result, habit and unhealthy food choices are not contradictory. Sensory pleasure can be regarded as well as an important reason for escaping from rational behavior. As shown in many papers, consumers don't seem to be ready to compromise the sensory features of their food products for potential benefits to their health. Regarding age, this other important issue, it seems to increase individual consciousness about the importance of health, diet, and healthy habits. Social pressure and cultural issues tend to be related and have an important effect on food choices. Well, a clear example, I think, is the progressive abandon of the Mediterranean diet in Spain in favor of more unhealthy food habits. And other important issues such as contradictory recommendations and the excess of information provided seems to produce a negative effect on the association between diet and health. Here you can see a piece of information published in the New York Times about the daily salt intake. So now it seems that we don't need to reduce our salt intake to the levels previously recommended. Well, obviously, this type of information and contradictory messages have an important effect on the general public, and the main negative result is a loss of credibility in experts' recommendations. So I think that we should avoid this type of things, at least from the consumer perspective. Well, now I would like to focus on cross-cultural differences regarding diet and health associations by means of some examples. Here you can see, for instance, how the same product has different commercial names depending on the European country where it is sold. In Italy and Spain, the product seems to highlight the healthy component by adding the word beta, that means life. However, for instance, in France or in UK, the same product seems to be more oriented towards the physical appearance of the potential buyers than to the health side of the product. Here you can see the results from a survey that we carried out in 6 European countries within a European project from the 6th Framework Programme called True Food. And in this case, we have the health dimension of the food choice questionnaire. And as you can see, there are important differences between some of the countries involved, especially between Norway and Poland. And here you have also, from the same project, from the True Food project, and we can observe the effect of body mass index over the different measure constructs. And we found a positive relationship between BMI and the health dimension of the food choice questionnaire. So those consumers having higher BMI were also paying more attention to health issues when eating, and a negative association with subjective health that seems to indicate that overweight participants have a lower self-reported perception of their own health status. Well, regarding countries, for instance, France had a higher number of individuals in clusters 2 and 3, and a lower number of participants in cluster 1. And for instance, Italy had a higher weight in cluster 4. This figure shows those aspects that had a positive or a negative influence on BMI. Norway and Spain show the highest percentage of overweight participants. Strange result, at least for me. And subjective health and gender were most important aspects in predicting BMI. Well, this table belongs to a cross-cultural study that we carried out in different places in Europe and in South America about well-being. In this case, we did a free word association test with 150 consumers per country. And as you can see, different dimensions were detected, and here you have these dimensions and their frequency. Well, the psychological dimension had the highest importance for French consumers, and this dimension includes words such as calm, happiness, comfort, pleasure, etc. Meanwhile, for French consumers, the health dimension had the lowest number of mentions. Well, the results tend to indicate that for French participants, health has a clear secondary role when dealing with personal well-being. Well, if you look at the Spanish results, you can see how the present situation is affecting consumers' well-being. So economical and occupational dimensions were especially and significantly relevant for participants from this country, from Spain. Well, in a food context, the previous mentioned differences between France and the other countries even become more important here. In all cases, and in a context of food consumption, well-being was mainly related to health issues, with the sole exception of France. In France, well-being in the food context was mainly related with pleasure. Well, I have to inform you that these French participants came from Angers. Well, I don't know if this information is relevant or not, but Well, the last example that I would like to show you is about consumers' concern about food additives. Well, as you can see, the level of concern depends on the country. There are some differences, and in some cases, such as in Romania, on the product itself. Well, in fact, we expect it to have similar effect depending on the food product in all the countries. And this was the reason because we choose, I suppose, more natural and low processed products such as cheese versus a less natural and processed food like chips. Well, and now to finish, let me show you a diagram where I try to summarize my presentation. Well, we have strong evidences that health is an important mediator of food choices. The relevance of health of each individual is subjective in nature and dynamic. I mean that it evolves during a lifetime, mainly because learning processes and personal experiences. And the way in which this personal health perception drives food choices can be affected by different interferences, such as habit, optimistic bias, sensory effect, cultural and social issues, among others. And depending on these two aspects, I mean the subjective perception and the type and strength of the interferences, individuals can move towards a more healthy and active side, like this, or towards a more unhealthy or sedentary option, like this. So theoretically, consumers' education on food culture by means of effective informative strategies should modify subjective perception and should minimize interferences leading to a healthier eating and lifestyle. Okay, this is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luis. So we have time for 2 or 3 questions, if any. I can see you. Okay, thank you. So maybe I have one question, since you didn't mention the sex difference between this gap, to explain the gap between diet and health. Are there some studies on that? Sex difference? Yes.
Yeah. Well, in fact, to find gender differences between consumers is quite frequent in consumer behavior. There are some explanations about these differences between men and women. Probably one of the most easy to understand or to explain is that women are still the main responsible for food shopping and food preparation at home. Probably this is the reason, because they tend to be more aware about the healthy effect of food selection and food consumption. I think this is probably one of the main reasons.
Okay, no more question. So we will move just on time for the next speaker. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Luis.